Tonight, we're excited to be in conversation with Alex Tom, who's a good friend of mine and also someone who's an inspiration to so many people. So we'll talk a little bit about his work and hear about his tips and ideas for folks who are getting involved in different social change movements. I'm Deepa Iyer, and I am with Building Movement Project and Solidarity Is. And for those of you who are joining, it's great to see where you're joining from. I see Chicago, I see Queens. Tell us where you're joining from, and if you'd like, tell us a phrase or a word that reflects your state of being. Doesn't have to be your state of mind, could be your state of being right now. So for those of you who already know, the Solidarity Semester has been a 5-week online training series where we have been talking about, learning about transformative solidarity practice and social change. And believe it or not, as someone is saying on the chat, this is the last day. Yes, it's kind of anticlimactic. If you joined us on Tuesday, you know that you heard from all of the members of our team, and I just wanted to give them all a shout out again. Anna and Catherine, Deborah, Marone, Shelby, for just being an amazing group of people to work with and to put this 5-week series together. And also thanks to you all for being part of the conversation, and hope that you'll continue to be part of these conversations. So please check out Building Movement Project. Please check out solidarityis.org and really stay connected to us and connected to our work. You can even go back, and if you didn't have a chance, you can watch the IG lives that we did with 4 other folks. Sorry about my light here. 4 other folks who are movement leaders as well, that you can always look at and find online. So I'm going to bring Alex into the conversation as more folks are joining. This is great. And if you know Alex, please let us know that too, because I think some folks are here just for Alex, which is great. Let's see here. All right, so Alex should be joining us in just a second. As he's joining, there he is. Hi, Alex.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thank you so much for making the time.
Yes, so exciting. It's my first time.
Is it your first IG Live?
I've only heard about them, and I
too learned more about IG Live this year.
I try to make sure I had everything right.
You're perfect. You're perfect. So you might see on in the chat, folks are here, and I asked them to sort of say a little bit about where they're joining from, and also maybe something about their state of being right now. So some folks were saying they're feeling like they're getting organized. Others have other parts on their mind. So I'll ask you, I'll say that for myself, I decided to wear my, you can't really see it probably, my nap off t-shirt today by Grace and Yuri and Helen, and because I'm trying to get more inspired by all of the Asian American women who have paved the way for so many of us. So that is my state of mind and being. But what about you? How are you feeling?
You know, it's like this contradictory feeling, feeling very inspired, but also really scared right now about how many, when's the next shoe going to drop? And I think just kind of trying to stay as focused on my purpose, North Star. Got my son here. Concretely, materially, he is a big core part of my purpose.
I know.
And you might. Oh, it's all good. Yeah.
Yeah. If folks are interested, you should also check out. Alex has a great blog. Is it called a blog now? Okay, Diary of a Baba, where he writes very vulnerably and openly about being a dad, but also doing this work while being a dad, right? And you might hear my son, who is sometimes quiet and sometimes not. So we'll see how it goes tonight. But Alex, let's start by actually, I wanted, I think I mentioned this earlier, that a lot of the folks who have joined us for the Solidarity Semester are people who are activated by the generational moments that we're all going through, right? Whether it's the pandemic, whether it is the uprisings over the spring and the summer, whether it's sort of the political environment. And I'm curious to know, can you share what were some generational moments in your life that shaped you and your work in the Asian American community and what you do now?
Well, I'm really honored to just join this conversation. I had a chance to listen to the previous ones, and there's so many like movement rock stars and just a lot of people who basically are just doing the work. And I have to move, but and also Deepa, a lot of the work that you've been doing has been really important to visibilize a lot of us who are often forgotten in kind of like the movement, like the kind of chaos that people see as the movement, and a lot of the invisible labor that folks do. And just for folks to know, I'm 44 this year, so I am very proud to not only be a Baba, but also a not so cranky Yelder. And so I feel like this is kind of the role that I've been playing, and I'm just really glad to be able to join this conversation. Yeah. But for your question, I think there are a lot of different moments. People get born into this, right? I think my family came before the 1965 Immigration Act, and they moved into San Francisco Chinatown, worked in the restaurants, garment factories, and then they started a small business. And I'm gonna move. Okay, so
take your time.
Yes, all right.
Once we had, I don't know if you saw our IG live with Judith Brown Dianas.
No, she was driving.
The advancement project. She was driving after having dropped off her college age child, young person to college. So this is life, and so it's totally fine.
Thank you. Yeah, so our family came on an artist visa, which is something that's pretty rare, and started one of the first jewelry businesses in San Francisco Chinatown that was very successful. And so we were able to move out of Chinatown into Sunset, which is a little bit nicer area in San Francisco, and into a pretty nice suburb called Fremont, which is now very Asian, but at the time it was like pretty much we were one of the few Asian families moving into the block. And so being in that environment really changed my life. Like within the first week or so, we had KKK sprayed on our house.
Oh God.
Our car, our sidewalk, and to really think about the contours of this, my family, they didn't know what the KKK was. They actually thought it was like Black people coming in from San Francisco, or the Italians, right? And so you just think about the narratives that our immigrant families grow into, and also how they're pitted against each other. And then later on in life, I was like, did you not know what the KKK was? And they're like, well, we just thought this was like the best place for you all to grow up in. And it was, to a degree. It was like so much nicer, and also it was a lot of heaviness because of the racism. And I think because I grew up pretty nerdy, introverted. I was colorblind. I was just like a very easy person to pick on. And so just growing up in just like that kind of environment, I think just really gave me this tendency towards like joining the other oddballs and the other people as part of the resistance. And so that's sort of like one of the things. But I also did participate in a lot of youth programs in San Francisco. And that, I would say, is probably the biggest moment where they planted those seeds to connect my identity as a cis male, Asian American, Chinese American, middle class person with a rural Native person, with Puerto Ricans in New York, to Black folks.
Wow. So these are youth programs happening in San Francisco that you were part of, because that's rare.
I was 14. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of the kind of programs that we run now, but this one was like, this one literally was a anti-fascist camp that was started by Eleanor Roosevelt. And and it's weird to say anti-fascist now because it's like seems like this is the new trending word, but before I was like, what is fascism? I was like, but we learned a lot, and I think that really ingrained a lot of my politics and how I show up as an Asian American.
I think that's so interesting because, this solidarity semester, and thanks to more folks have joined us, which is great. I'm in conversation with Alex Tom. This is what we think of as movement education. And
Right.
I think a lot of folks don't actually get that. I mean, I think you're super lucky to have had that. We're in the same age generation, and I grew up in Kentucky, after I was 12, and don't remember ever even thinking about those issues at that age because no one was talking about them in my community, and I didn't even have the language. So I was curious about, I know you also do movement education now as well, and you think it's important. Why is it so important that at a young age, whether it's 14, or I think a lot of the folks that are part of the semester have described this happening in college? Why is it so important to learn about these, not just ideas and frameworks, but to have a real kind of political awakening that is connected to your identity?
Yeah. It's like planting and nourishing seeds and ideas, people, because it takes a lot of nurturance. Yeah. And I think, and to quote one of the movement leaders that I look to in the Southeast Asian community, Kajwa, who runs Freedom Inc., she talks about, like, in the moments of BLM and even George Floyd, it's like, how do we move people from becoming moment leaders to movement leaders, right? So, and it's not magic, right? It's not just like big flashpoints and then they all become organizers, right? And in a lot of ways, it's like, I call it like we have a very free market capitalist approach to leadership development. We just have these big things and then we just expect somehow some invisible hand to be like, oh, these people are all going to join our organizations. But it's also, our organizations are sometimes very toxic and our movement culture is not very inviting. So we actually need to invest in young people in an intentional way. It takes a stewardship, and as a very proud Yelder, and I see you doing this, and a lot of people like Kajwa and also Alicia Garza, there's a lot of people who are basically trying to be stewards in this moment, because it is not magic, right? It takes that kind of intention and modeling too. I mean, I've had young people tell me like, I never want to be like you. You look so angry, you look disheveled, you drink a lot of tea and coffee, and it just doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like you're living the life you want, being part of this movement. And that was like 10 years ago. And I tell that person who still is working at the Chinese Progressive Association, she really changed my life, because she was just like being honest. She's like, I never want to do what you do. That's how we need to model at the same time, right? So it's very dynamic. Yeah. And so part of it is planting the seeds, stewarding, and also modeling, right? Like as a cis male Asian American, I'm learning how to become more vulnerable, right? And it's like a daily practice, and it's something that I talk to a lot of other young men about, and it's like, how do we show up in this movement, right? So you're fighting like white supremacy, but you're also benefiting from patriarchy, right? And a lot of other privileges. And so it's takes a lot of resilience to be able to really do that.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of what we've been talking about often in the classes is self-awareness, and right, like the time to actually reflect on where we're at, taking the time, because the movement moments. You said this when you first got on. You said something about the chaos of the movement. There's always a crisis. There's always something to kind of get organized around and to respond to. And a lot of times there isn't the time to reflect and sit back and course correct and change. And so I really appreciate you naming that too. But so I'm going to come back to some of those pieces around human education, but I also want folks to know about your trajectory, because you did the bulk of your work was with Chinese Progressive Association, or CPA.
Right.
And so share a little bit about why your work is so grounded. I mean, I think I understood from, your childhood and growing up in Chinatown and the the youth leadership development programs, but why was it so important to be grounded in the Asian American community? And share a little bit about what CPA's priorities are as well for folks who don't know.
Yeah, so I'll bring it back to San Diego, because that's where I feel like I cut my teeth, and that was in college. And it was good, because coming out from the Bay Area, it is like a bubble. People say that, and it actually is true. Like, where else do they have anti-fascist youth camps, right?
Yeah.
And so very Bay Area, right? And so going to San Diego and living in the U.S.-Mexico border region during 187, the era of Pete Wilson, who was worse than President Trump, and 9/11, and really being out of my element, because the Asian Americans, and no shade to the Southern California Asians, but the culture is very different. And people were always like, "You're one of those Bay Area Asians. You're one of those people." And I was like, what are you talking about? And because I supported affirmative action, right? Because those seeds were planted very early on.
Yeah.
And so this trek of me identifying as like, what does an Asian American, what is my role, right? Because I basically became the invisible Asian organizing Black and brown young people. That was my role. And to the point where, and I know some of them are probably here from San Diego, but I don't think people realized I was Asian. It was like to that point, because in a lot of ways, it was just the conversations like Black and brown, and even myself, it's like, I never really talked about myself being Chinese, Asian American. And there was a point where I was like, and I stayed in San Diego for like 8-9 years, and I was doing really great work. And I was thinking, this is not really my community, quote unquote. It's like, I've built youth organizations, and some of them are still around now, and it's beautiful, but I needed to hand it off to people who are from the community. And that's the process I went into, because I said, well, I speak Mandarin and Cantonese. My family is from Chinatown. Isn't it time for me to come back to my community? And to be honest, for a lot of the young people listening, it's like, when you go back to your own community to organize, it is so hard, because so much judgment, so many standards, so many expectations. But as a non-Black or brown person organizing in a different community, you just get props all the time. It was great. I actually love being in non-Asian spaces, because I'm just like, yo, this is so great, right? But it's very true. It's not about what we want, right? It's like sometimes it is about like your unique contributions. Sometimes you just got to do things that are not too sexy. So I decided I'm going to go back into my community. And early on, I decided that I was going to stay for a long time. I said, no matter how hard this is, no matter if I'm called a sellout, not Chinese enough, or too whitewashed because I have progressive ideas, I was just ready for all of it. Oh, your Chinese is really bad. Oh, what is, anyways, all these kinds of things. Okay, now I'm starting to like show my trauma here, but it's real. Yeah. But it's real, right? Yeah, so it is. So being grounded in the community was really important, and I was there for 15 years. And I told myself, I committed to myself for 5 years that I was going to stay. After 5 years, I said, I'm going to stay another 10 years. And I had to think about that, because I had some big ambitions and aspirations for this organization. Chinese Progressive Association was started in the 70s based on solidarity principles, working class principles, inspired by the Black Panther Party. And in that moment, it was really about building the kind of capacity in your community to link up with other movements. So it was very much about like, all right, Latinx folks, Indigenous folks, Black folks need to organize their own in the community, and we come together and build solidarity. And that was ingrained from the beginning. And so I feel very honored and privileged to be in that organization for 15 years. I transitioned out into this new organization, but we're still very connected.
Yeah.
It was very intergenerational. Like we had membership as young as like 14 and as old as 90. So we could count many, like I have so many stories of the people who were part of the Chinese Revolution in 1949 in China.
Yeah.
And then they came here and they were like, you all talk about this revolution, but you have not been through one. And you have not seen how challenging it is to govern. I mean, things that they were telling me 15 years ago, I was like, govern, like to be in charge. Cause like we were very used to campaigning and resisting.
Right.
And so being able to learn from the seniors, but also learning from the young people. The young people, they were able to push us on a lot of really important issues. Like we have a homophobic history, right? The organization and the left in general is not very kind to queer folks, let alone trans folks. But our young people really pushed us to say, don't tell us to find a queer friendly space. Make this the queer friendly space.
Right.
And I always get a little choked up about that because just a lot of courage to do that. And not to just say that to me, but to say that to the people who founded this organization who are 65 and 70, right? So being in a grassroots organization and being grounded and seeing all the we talk about solidarity, the performative aspects of it. No one talks about how hard it is, like the pain, the trauma it is to have to kind of live through each other's challenges when you're being called out, not really because you are the target, but because no one else knows where else to put it, right? And I think that's like, it takes a lot of trust to be like, we say call in and stuff, but some calling in is still really hard, and I think this is the practice that we have to build. And so I was able to practice that at CPA, find my squad, people that I'm working with still today, and really find where I feel like I'm the most alive and needed. And that's what's the most powerful about being part of a grassroots organization.
Yeah, I really appreciate, first of all, I think CPA, and I've told you this, I think CPA is an extraordinary organization in the Asian American space, because there's something about the Bay Area, CPA's history, because you don't find organizations like that and Asian American organizations like that in many other parts of the country. So it's sort of an organization that is ahead of its time in so many ways, but that we can all learn from, the intergenerational aspect, the solidarity aspect. So I want to ask you about solidarity next. But before I do that, I know a lot of folks are joining, which is wonderful. I'm Deepa Iyer with Building Movement Project. This is Alex Tom, who just talked about his work for 15 years with the Chinese Progressive Association. And we're going to transition now to talk about the Center for Empowered Politics and what that is about. But if you have questions for Alex, please go ahead and put them into the chat. I'm just going to check the chat really quickly to see, because I did see some folks. So someone wrote, feel that is a mixed Korean who grew up in a white town. I think reflecting back on what you said about coming back to community or feeling kind of not completely aligned. Other people shouted out San Diego as well when you talk about San Diego work. So there's some people who
Dago in the house.
Yes, absolutely. But feel free, folks, to put questions into the chat, questions you have for Alex, questions you have for, anything around Asian American organizing, right? Around solidarity practice. So feel free to put those in. But let's talk a little bit about solidarity. I mean, you talked about solidarity principles being sort of the cornerstone of CPA, and that you grew up in that way as well. So we talk about solidarity principles a lot, and we talk about them as solidarity as a verb and a practice, right? Not necessarily an outcome, but a verb, a practice, and a strategy. Okay, we have more San Diego people than I think it's one person.
I think the same person. All good.
So I'm curious to know, from the standpoint of Asian American organizing, what have been some of the challenges when it comes to transformative solidarity practice that you have seen? And what are some ways in which Asian Americans are, practicing that kind of transformative, deep solidarity?
Yeah, this question is always a hard one, and you always ask it.
I know.
It's I would say that the Asian American identity has like shifted and changed so much. It's very diverse still, very complex. And I think more recently, the things that I'm wanting to lift up more and more is the driving forces in the Asian American movement, which is, I would say, Southeast Asian, queer, trans folks that often do not get mentioned when we talk about the Asian American movement, right? And that's important because I can speak about the Chinese right wing in our community, which is the most organized, right? And then you also have the Southeast Asian refugee folks in the Asian American community that have been living side by side with Black folks from the beginning, right? They've been in solidarity with them for the many decades that they've been in this country, right? Or you could even talk about organizations like CPA and other organizations that kind of born out of the Asian left movement at that time, right? And so Arab Muslim communities, like there's so many various subsets. Yes, I'm on a meeting. I told you. Okay. So excited. All good. So it's really important to just lift up where the kind of, it's like the driving forces of the right and the driving forces of like the progressive and left edge are all within the same community. And even I would say like the Chinese right-wing community is a very vocal minority. It's a small part of the Chinese community, but it's like very, very, very loud. And they have actually gone after not just Black, Latinx communities, they have gone after other Asian Americans, right? And so the strategy is very clear. And so the thing that makes it really hard is because what they talk about is the isolation and the alienation that they feel in this country. And actually it's true. Statistically, Democrats and Republicans do not try to reach out to these Chinese immigrants and even to our own base, right? Because they're like, well, they're kind of an indecisive community, so we're just not going to invest, where they go, because like they go left to right in a span of 4 to 8 years, right? And that's just like, and this goes back to a lot of the experiences again of them being in China and hearing about the many stages of revolution in the country, and knowing that in a lot of ways they are kind of like the movable middle, right? And like, and that's sort of like part of the psyche, right? But where I think it's important to lift up is also that I say this a lot because there's a lot of Chinese Americans like myself, we get a little angsty about our people, right? We're like, oh, we gotta get our cousins. Oh, Andrew Yang, what? You just kind of get really, and I mean, every community does that to their own, but really it is very clear that the right wing is not actually winning, right? They're not winning. We are not contesting actually for the hearts and minds of these people. They're virtually uncontested, right? And I say that because, just humbly speaking, like if you put all the Chinese grassroots organizations together in the country, they're all focused on the urban areas. And we have more and more people in the suburban areas. Yeah. And you have like working class folks out there too. And so there's something about how the movement is structured. And so when I think about taking on the Chinese right wing, maybe the bigger question is like, how do we actually organize outside of our traditional urban hubs, right? And how do we talk to people who have a different immigration history, and how are we actually prioritizing that? Yeah. How do we think about cross-class kinds of coalitions, right? So even, I would say like, even if you're a worker, a lot of our members who are restaurant workers did not automatically mean they're progressive, right? But if you could move 30% of them, and then you can move like 15% of suburban Chinese immigrants, like, just an idea, like,
Yeah.
and then you're moving like Black communities, which tend to trend more progressive, and
Mhm.
Latinx, right? So that is the new we, right?
Yeah.
Because yeah, a lot of people are like, y'all got to go get your cousins, and I'm like, we got to get them together, because we are family, right? Just because that person is Chinese doesn't mean that we are linked because of our blood, right?
Yeah.
Because we have broader values. So,
Yeah.
anyways, I don't know if that is
It is
helpful.
It's super helpful. And I like that you started off talking about, when I asked the question, right, you started talking about like inter-solidarity, which we actually don't talk about a whole lot. And I think it's so important because it's important to recognize that the Asian American community is not a monolith, right? It's also a political identity, and folks who read about it and study it and will understand that it's not a natural identity.
Right.
But the thing that I wanted to lift up about what you said, which I don't hear a lot, is that you spoke about the right wing, and we've talked about this, like in the Indian community.
Yep.
Also, the Chinese right wing and the Indian right wing are collaborating, right? But I think there's sometimes this way in which we kind of dispose of people and throw them away.
Yes.
And say like, well, those are those like uncles and aunties, and I'm done with them. Like, I don't need to talk to them. And I really
cancel.
Yeah. But I appreciate that you didn't do, you talked about that community of people with a lot of care, it doesn't have to be love or affection, but it's care. Like, these are also, they are part of our community too. And you can't just throw them away. And so it is, but it's hard. It is so hard,
it's very hard.
to have like a sense of, okay, like, I'm going to try to talk to you, even though I am so aggravated and frustrated with whatever it is, right, that you're professing, like your anti-affirmative action, you're filing lawsuits. Like, I live in Silver Spring, and recently there was a lawsuit by Asian Americans against, saying like X program discriminates against them, where it's actually an affirmative action program, right?
Right.
And so it's very difficult, but I appreciate you not disposing of folks and say like, forget it, we don't care, because we can't do that either.
Yeah. And there are groups that are really investing in this. And I'm just going to name like Chinese for Affirmative Action.
Yeah.
They have taken the brunt of all of the attacks from the Chinese right wing for defending affirmative action, and like Prop 16, which is reinstating affirmative action, and doing a lot of work organizing digitally on WeChat as well.
Yeah.
And then API Force, which is another organization that is like focused on like really thinking about how do we do the suburban organizing. And they just did a pilot this summer and actually found that most people are still in the middle. Like, I think people just assume that our people are right wing and give up on them. But when you actually talk to them, it's very nuanced. And basically it's sort of like when people do the call out thing, I'm just like, have you ever talked to your auntie? Have you, it's like without yelling. It's like talking to my kid. I was like, be calm before you start yelling. But it's like, it's hard. It's very triggering.
Yeah.
Even like, So anyways, just to say, I think there is work to be done.
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm going to pull up a question.
I see a question here.
And before I do that, I saw, was it Scott or Soya? I don't know. I think it's one of you, probably Soya, because I don't think Scott does IG Live, who said, much love to you, Alex and Deepa. So important to lift up these challenges, truths, and lessons learned. So if that's you, Soya, we love you. And if it's Scott, we love you too. Okay, so we've got one from Catherine Foley. How do you do that? I think this is a question around, like, how do you not dispose and throw away people when someone's views are so violent and hurtful? When is it okay to say enough? And your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't have the answer, because I think it is such a case by case. And maybe one way to think about all of this stuff is like, there's a lot of pain and trauma in all kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
There's like anti-Asian sentiments in the Black community, anti-queer community, it's so many of that. And at the end of the day, it's like, do you have a squad of people to turn to, right? that you can lean on, that can challenge you, that can help you set boundaries, that can help you push you when your boundaries are way too protective, or I don't know how to describe that, but I think some people have no boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have like too strong boundaries, right? And then I think the other thing is like, how do we think about creating strong and brave spaces and not just like safe spaces? Mm-hmm. Because like there's a lot of young people I'm working with, and we do this in the youth program. It's like, there's no such thing as a perfect space, because we're in capitalism, patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, like so many layers of oppression. Every conversation around solidarity is going to be painful, like a real conversation, right? Because it is way the system is designed. Yeah. But how do you struggle through it? You know, some people have called this in the somatic terms like clean pain. Like, how do you let this pain kind of come through you? That is part of building the trust that's needed with each other, right? And so I think that is like the real question. It's like, if you're doing it on your own, that's going to be really hard. Yeah. But you have a crew of people where you're doing it together, and everyone has a really hard conversation. You all might say, this is not the time to talk to Chinese voters, right? You know, this is the time, maybe we need to help, you know, get the Black community to turn out to vote. So let's, you know, and I think maybe in a previous period of my life, I was like, well, no, we need to like talk to every Chinese person. And it's true, you do in some ways, but you also have to be strategic and also protect yourself from really hard things to come. And so I think that's how I would think about it. At the end, it's like, how do you strengthen your own core?
I really have never heard that. Clean pain. I'm going to look into that. But, you know, we talked about.
I didn't come up with it.
Yeah, but no, that's a real, because I think these are all strategies of kind of building, and then the safe, not just safe spaces, but brave and what was the other word? Strong. Yeah, which means that you have to be in generative struggle sometimes, right? Like, solidarity is about relationships. Relationships are inherently messy, and we bring a lot of baggage for whether it's historical trauma, individual, community, right? So being in generative struggle, and I love what you said earlier about modeling it, because it is much easier sometimes to walk away or to avoid, but sitting through it is important.
Yes.
So someone has asked another question. Jojo Flowmaster asks, what is the best part of your job? And maybe this is a good transition to talking about the Center for Empowered Politics.
Yes. Okay. This is great. And I don't know if I did this right. I wrote some notes. I was like, okay, I'm going to forget these things. Okay. So what do I like about what I do now? To be honest, and I wrote in my last blog, I wrote a little bit about this. My job right now is like flanking everyone around me. And, you know, I've heard Maurice from Working Families Party talk about this, Marisa from Mi Gente, Alicia, like we're in this place where it's like, there's so many people doing good work, right? And in my household, I'm flanking my partner who is running a big clinic. And I feel like I'm flanking my son sometimes, but all the people that I've worked with for the last 10, 15 years, I'm like really trying to provide that horizontal support. And it can look in different ways, right? It's sort of like, sometimes I'm like, what do you need me to do? I'm just going to do it. Sometimes it's coaching. Sometimes it's really providing the kinds of thought space to be able to help someone, you know, go through a really painful period and then help them think about what were the transformational moments in that, right? Because like we always think about the losses, and we're kind of like purists about that, but there's so many victories inside those moments. So I'm enjoying being like, and you know, someone once told me it's like being a movement fairy. Like I get to come in and like sprinkle some good vibes and make some things happen, because really we don't have enough of that kind of horizontal support for each other. So what I mean is like, if you think about what labor is valued in the movement, it's like the people who are doing it on the ground, right? Or grass tops. but there's a lot of invisible labor of like the mentorship, the nurturance, a lot of reproductive labor that queer women, folks have been doing for a very long time. We need to be compensating that and lifting up that labor. And as a cis man, I can totally talk about it. Now I could make it more visible, you know? It's like every 7 organizers, there should be a healer and a coach. Like that's like, or maybe should be every 3. But in a lot of ways, we need to, and this is like our elders who are providing a lot of mentorship for free. And when they can't even make rent sometimes, or, you know what I mean? There's like so much there that we have to think about labor in our movement. So in a lot of ways, I feel like I'm lucky to have created somewhat of a role for myself to just flank others, and really priorities in my C4 and PAC hat to defeat Trump is a priority, and to keep people in this for the long haul, regardless of what happens. Like there's going to be a lot of demoralization, win or lose, after this election. Yeah. And we're going to need to be in this for the long haul.
So thank you. I love that idea of flanking by playing different roles, depending on who you're flanking, right? And the movement fairy is great. I'm gonna have to get you to put some sprinkle
that was
fairy dust in my life.
Lynn. Yeah.
So let's actually, folks, feel free to ask more questions. So let's actually talk about that, understanding that, you know, with your C4 hat on, you know, curious to know how you are thinking about preparedness as well as responsiveness after this election from the standpoint of movement folks, right? I think that this is a question that we've heard from a lot of the young people in the solidarity semester. Like, how do we, we're, you know, like we're exhausted, we're scared, but we're also motivated. Yeah. So how do we prepare? What are we preparing for? And how do we kind of deal with what happens afterwards? So what would some of your advice be and your perspectives on that?
This election is definitely the most unprecedented ever. And no one can say this is just like a typical election. Because I think there's some people who are still thinking in a more abstentionist way to say, well, the electoral system's never done any good.
Right.
But Donald Trump will definitely do something very bad and dangerous. And so I would lift up 2 entities to kind of follow. One is a super PAC that I helped to start, which is Seat the Vote. And the other one is the Frontline, which is a collaboration of Working Families Party and Movement for Black Lives. And the reason why it's important is because there is kind of a dichotomy. Some people are all thinking about the election only, and some people are thinking about the protests after. Now we need to think about them together and you know, it's like taking, like in your ecosystem diagrams, like taking different roles. Like the day the election, the day after the election, in a lot of ways, those forces who are doing electoral work are going to need a break.
Right.
And they need to be coordinated with the people who are ready to demonstrate and to show that Trump is an illegitimate candidate, right? And to really be there to push out the kinds of messages that we need. And that's gonna be important. So Frontlines is doing some of that work, and Seating Vote is doing a lot of the day-to-day stuff for the election, and Frontline is doing text banking and also doing a lot of the election defense work afterwards. And this is what's really different in this time. We are seeing sectors move and work together in ways that I have not seen before. You know, it's like beyond the united front, it's a popular front, it's a multi-sectoral strategy that is bringing everyone from like, you know, liberal Democrats with anarchists, right? Like how and when has that ever really happened, right? Of course, there's a lot of tension still, but the point is we are united against authoritarianism and fascism that is really on the rise. And so the things that we want to make sure people know is that win or lose, it will be a contested election. And there are going to be people we need to take care of.
Right.
And the people we need to take care of are our members in our base in the community who are going to be demoralized, young people, lot of people who feel isolated, and it's going to be a lot of work to really take care of those people. And we have to get ready for that, right? And then we also have to get ready for the story. What's the story? Like, if we do win, then there's going to be like, oh, these 3 groups, they made it happen, you know? And when it's like, well, hold up, we've been doing this for 15, 20 years,
right?
You know? And if we lose, then it's just like this sort of like demoralization that takes over, because then we forget that there are a lot of other movement moments that basically need to be lifted back up. So there's a lot of these kinds of ways in which there's like a way we need to take care of the front lines, tell the right stories, and also not turn against each other, right? Now, I think this is gonna, and I know this already has happened, like during George Floyd. It's like not we, but like some of us fell into the right-wing trap of focusing on the looters and the rioters, right? And I saw a lot of well-intentioned people who were like, well, we are not them. We are, you know? And really, it's sort of like, well, actually, the real culprit is still this president, right? And it's the police, and it's the military. And I think that the system, and that is going to continue to be the situation where you're going to be, you know, are you the good protester or the bad protester? And this is really hard, especially in the Asian communities, because there were a lot of businesses that were destroyed and damaged. And how do we prepare and not fall into the traps of what the right wing is going to like so easily put us into?
Yeah, no, and you're totally right. And that's super helpful to think about both who we need to prepare, what we need to prepare for in terms of the folks that we're taking care of, you know, afterwards, but also how we actually tell multidimensional stories. Like, there's no one narrative, right? And it's really important to tell different stories, multiple stories. And it goes back to what you said earlier, which when you were quoting, I think, Kajwa, that it's not just the moment, but how do we create, what did you say? It's movement.
It's movement. I'm sorry, moment leaders to movement leaders.
Yes, moment leaders to movement leaders, which actually is a great part of the great segue to the next question, which is, so we have a lot of young folks joining us and who watch these IG lives later. Can you share some advice for how folks actually, because many are mobilized by the moments of this year,
right.
Like, what is it that you would advise so that folks actually turn those moments into like becoming movement leaders? When you mentioned one already, which I think is super helpful, like the squad, right? You have to have like an ecosystem of people around you, which is so important. But are there other pieces of advice you would give folks?
Yeah, I would say to really, really explore what your purpose is, what gives you joy and what keeps you alive. When I say explore, it's like you might be doing something, you're like, oh, this is my lane or my role, and I really love this, but you actually haven't done it yet. So you start doing it and you're like, oh, other people got this. I'm not really that good at it.
Yeah.
Or I'm good at something, I don't really want to do that. Like, you know, it's like, but really it's like trying to really find that, and it has to happen dynamically with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like owning what you want as being part of this collective movement. So it's like not subsuming yourself, but also not overemphasizing yourself either. So that's like really a hard dynamic. Because I think some people just want to do it and do like, okay, I got this and I'm going to do this. And sometimes that leads to either great things or more isolation.
Yeah.
So that's one thing.
Right.
The other one I would say kind of similarly to this, and I will quote Marisa, who runs Mi Gente. One time she's just like, I forget who she was talking to, but she's like, you know, be bold, but don't be foolish. It's like, in some ways, it's like and I don't know if this is what she exactly meant, but in some ways, it's like you can be bold and also have a plan and a strategy, and it's like it takes other people. You know, no one's trying to be a martyr here. So in some ways, we want to be bold, but be bold in a certain way, right? that doesn't burn you out necessarily, right?
Yes.
That actually is going to have some kind of broader transformation with the people around you. The other one I really like is it's sort of like how to deal with like the tensions, because there's a lot of inter-movement tension.
Yes.
And I think right now, and maybe for a long period of time, we need to learn to extend grace, space, like forgiveness in a lot of ways. So I always like to tell young people, it's like, we can forgive, but we don't need to forget. And keep the receipts. I mean, honestly, it's like, that is what's most important. It's like, I'm in some ways I'm like, oh, you just kind of messed me up. Okay, but I'm not going to pick that right now. I'm going to focus on this, but I'm not forgetting. And that's part of like, I think the liberalism in our culture. Sometimes you just kind of like shrug it off, or you confront it really, extra hard, so you get off-centered, right? But there's a way where you can stay focused and also remember the things people do. But we're all family, right?
Yeah.
It's all part of that solidarity stuff that we need to be doing.
Yeah, it's a movement messiness. It's just always going to be there, right? So that's great. I really I like what you said about the where Marisa had said bold but not foolish. I think that's super helpful, and also this purity, right? Like we can't have like these huge ideals for people to always get it right all the time. And I often say to especially folks who are coming into movement spaces, like, you don't have to be completely pure in your analysis and your framework. We're all learning. Like every time I do a conversation, I learn so much, that then I can use to interrogate the way that I show up, or what I'm thinking about, right? And how I actually write or speak or do work in the community. And so this idea of constantly being in a place of learning, I think is so important too, because nobody has it all figured out. And like, I don't think even, what did you call us, yelders? Like, we don't have it all figured out.
Oh, definitely. Definitely not.
And speaking about an area that I think all of us, even the yelders, are not so great at, is how are you sustaining yourself? Given that there's a lot happening, given that there are multiple crises that we're attending to every day, and they're taking an impact on us. It's not like we're, separated from what is happening, whether it's the pandemic or whether it's the protests or the election. What are ways in which you're actually building your own sustainability so that you can keep doing this work for the long run?
Yes, this has been really important for me because I turned 44 this year, had a little bit of a health scare where you can't really tell, but I had like this ongoing persistent eye twitch since COVID, and it has lasted a pretty long time. And so it was a wake-up call. And I would say this is not the first time the body was telling me something, but I took it really, really seriously. And so part of the reason why I'm flanking other folks too is because I know that I'm going to need to be on auxiliary right now to help other people who are on the front lines. And that's a very clear role based on my personal assessment of myself and kind of the role of the in my community. So that's one thing. So I definitely have been much more sharper and clear about my capacity, being very aware of like what I can and cannot be doing, being very honest with the people around me. But in terms of actual practices, I have started acupuncture weekly, which it is pretty amazing. And it's like this, and it's such an old school thing where it's like, it's trying to heal the body from the inside, right?
I'm a total supporter of this.
Right?
I also then, like, do it weekly.
Your body, and your body can like regenerate. And I was like, oh, that's so deep. And so that's really important. I restarted my somatic therapy, which has been really important because there's a lot of trauma and a lot of healing work that's needed, especially if you're doing coaching. And it's like when you, like my therapist needs to have a therapist too, right? So we're transferring, like again, the clean
healers need healers.
Yes, and it's like, and I think it's important for like cis men to be more explicit about that because like we all need help. And maybe I would say more like men need more help. But the other thing is long bike rides. Like I've used my long bike rides to hide from my child and just be away for a long time. And it's been really helpful for me. It's like, I never thought I was going to be one of those middle-aged, spandex wearing, which I do not have a spandex yet, but
yeah, I don't think
I'm
I
like,
can see you in that.
but anyways, I feel like those things have really helped me in the times, and I'm learning from other people too, other parents, and
I think it's so interesting because when I've asked this question, I've asked it to all of the other folks that you know, right, that have been part of these IG lives. Yours have been so clearly about the body, and I think that's so interesting that you're honing in on that, but also really helpful. And I know that for like when I was like in my 20s, I maybe didn't think about that as much, right, as I do that I'm now in my 40s. But it is so important to build a practice around, like you said, listening to your body, because your body does give messages often to, where you're at, where your subconscious is, or what you need to pay attention to. And kind of coming into alignment with one's body is so important. It's a practice, but I really appreciate you naming that as something. And I know we're close to the end, and so if folks have any last questions, you should put them in now for Alex. We have had such a conversation about so many things, from inter-Asian solidarity to brave and strong spaces to clean pain, which is something I'm going to look up right after we finish, to centering our body, and also the politics, right, of movement building. So we've had a conversation about all these pieces, which I so appreciate you sharing with us. But I also know that you're a parent, right? And I'm curious to know, as you think about Colin and how he's growing up, how are you kind of putting movement education, like how are you kind of bringing that into the parenting that you both are doing with him?
Maybe this is one of those things that they will talk about when they're 10 or 12, is they live, because we are co-working, they hear everything, they live through everything, they are very aware. And it's a little bit sad in some ways because, some folks might know that Nancy Nguyen from Viet Lead and some of the other Vietnamese folks were picked up from for doing an action against ICE. And, we were just in the middle of getting all the updates. And at that moment, he was like, that means you're going to go to jail.
Oh, gosh.
And I just think this, and, we cannot compare to like other countries under fascist authoritarian period, but we are in a period where that kind of trauma is going to continue to live with our children, right? Mm-hmm. It's either going to agitate him to want to be in the movement, or it's going to grow antagonism on why we're, you know what I mean? And I think like this is like a very, so it is very much like we're doing movement education every day. And, sometimes I have to move away and like protect him from some of it. And I mean, he hears about everything. And, my partner is a physician. So they talk about COVID and the death rates and all of the things that are happening. And it's really hard to be around us, So, but I want to believe that we are providing him agency and belief that we can change things, but mostly that he's going to be protected. Like we are going to be there for him regardless.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I agree. My son is 10, as you know, and he definitely, I think they hear everything.
Yes, I'm sure he knows.
Yeah. He said the word white supremacy today on his own. And I was like, oh, well, you're really listening to my conversations, obviously. But there's one question here that I didn't pick up because I literally did not scroll properly. I'm still learning IG Live, as you can see. But
I am too.
If folks are here, you're welcome to stay. If you have to leave, because I know, and I'm sorry if I'm keeping you, but there's a question here from Sean. What do you think people often misunderstand that leads them to foolish strategies rather than bold ones? I think going back to that that you talked about.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that one-liner. I think there's a lot of different things, right? And some stuff you've talked about, it's like it takes self-awareness, right? So it's like the questions I ask myself sometimes, like, am I taking this action because I'm trying to prove something to myself, right? Is this something that's going to make me like feel like I'm proving something to myself, proving something to other people. And then in your group, it's like, what's the purpose of what we're trying to do? So that's like the awareness part. The other part, which is like just harder to do, is like having intergenerational relations with other movement people. There's no, like, you can look at theory and everyone can read theory all, you know, but when you look at history, like I'm always like asking our OGs, I'm like, why did you try to do that? You try to understand how they made their assessments at that time. When did they pick a fight and when did they not? Or when they did pick that fight and then they're like, oh, we shouldn't have done that. And then so there's like this, so in a lot of ways, like to look at strategy, it has to be infused practice and looking, it's like, there's like this Tai Chi move, like Helen Kim always taught us. It's like, you know, when you reach back, you know, it's like you're looking back into history and you're just looking back with no judgment. And then you want to like push all of that energy forward, the good shit. And that's what I think about like a movement strategy. And, you know, not all of us have access to elders. You know, not everyone has a squad, right? So I think sometimes like maybe the clear takeaway is like, try not to act on your own, right? Try to be in community with others. And then if there's like people who've been doing this for a long time, there's sort of like this feeling like we want to, there's a lot of judgment in some ways. And we have to think about like, who is the main target, right? It's like, at the end of the day, the system is very clear, the target, and that's like the primary contradiction. And then the other people around, some people that are doing things I don't agree with. Yeah. Again, I'm just gonna be like, okay, I'm just taking those notes.
Keeping those receipts.
There you go.
But what you said is so important, which is that oftentimes we start over when we don't necessarily have to, because there is wisdom, right? And so like there are guides and visionaries around us who've actually done this for quite some time. So I don't think there's enough intergenerational movement building happening. And so I think that's something I'm learning here about how important it is, especially for young folks who are kind of getting started. So I know we're over time.
Well, we are the elders.
I know we're the elders. Yeah, you keep saying that. You're so good about proclaiming your age. So wow, I'm not there yet. I just keep saying mid-40s. But Rachna Chowdhury, who's a friend of ours, says, just so excited to hear both of you. Thanks so much. I've admired you for so long. Pebbles says, thanks so much for this. And Pebbles also had a question about your favorite food in San Diego. or your favorite food joint in San Diego. I don't know if you have
Cotihan was really the spot I went to all the time.
What's it called?
I don't know if it's Cotihan.
Okay, Pebbles. I don't know if you've been there. But...
I don't know if it's still around, but.
Well, you know what? Food is always a great place for us to end, because it's like so important to organizing and community building. But Alex, thank you. I miss you. I feel like we've seen each other in a really long time. But hopefully that will change next year.
Yes.
Thank you for your work. Thank you for your wisdom. And thank you for taking time away from your son to be with us.
It was great.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
For Solidarity Semester. We will be in touch with all of you. Take care. Bye.
Okay, bye.